Hello, welcome to Enterprise Tuesday. You see, to most people, Tuesday is just another day. But it's a special one. For one thing, it's not as awful as Monday. But really, I found that there are three things that make Tuesday a special one. Things that you probably haven't realized. The first one is victory. Apparently, Tuesday gets its name after the god Thew, or Tyr, which is the god of combat, glory, and victory. In fact, the Normandy landings, or D-Day, happened on a Tuesday. The second reason is inspiration. Psychologists found that Tuesday is the day to make things happen. Actually, people are 79%, are found to be 79% more inspired on a Tuesday than a Friday, for example. And they also found that meetings are most productive on a Tuesday. Perhaps people are more available and productive that day. The third reason Tuesday is a special one is, well, Shrove Tuesday. So between victory, inspiration, and pancakes, I don't know if Claire has any special plans for a networking session over pancakes next Tuesday, but for victory, thinking about it, what battle will you win tonight? Maybe the battle against the idea that it's too late to start something new, or it's too early to start something big. For the inspiration part, we have it covered for you. We have an excellent panel of experts, and I'll introduce them shortly. Enterprise Tuesday is brought to you by the Entrepreneurship Center, which is a center that offers educational programs for the whole entrepreneurial journey, from helping inspiring entrepreneurs, like many of you are, to creation and development of early-stage ventures, up to SME growth. And all these programs rely on the generosity of time and expertise of experts like the wonderful panel we have tonight, so thank you very much. I lead Enterprise Women, which is another program offered by the Entrepreneurship Center. It's a program that is tailored for women and minorities who have started a business and are looking to scale up. But it's open to everybody, and we have a suite of events coming up this year, so make sure you grab a flyer at the registration desk if you're interested. We're not expecting a fire alarm tonight, so if you hear the fire alarm, just run out of the building. You know where the main door is. We are live streaming tonight, so please silence your phone or turn them off. Otherwise, if your phone rings, we've got you on camera and we'll come after you. Because of the Extinction Rebellion outside, we are told that the door will be locked at 8, and there will not be anybody at the reception to let you in. So please make sure that you do not leave after 8 if you want to get back in. Or make sure you have somebody who can open the door for you. We do not want you to go out for a break and not be able to come back in for the networking. So that's me for tonight. I'd like to introduce you to our chair, George Neville-Jones. George is, you may know George already. He's a very familiar face at the business school. George is the local director of Metrobank. He's the secretary of the Cambridge Enterprise and Technology Club. And he is an officer in the British Army Reserve. So we all better behave tonight. He has a very interesting background in oceanography, and George has been very, very active in supporting enterprises through his network and financial expertise. George, thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Gina. Welcome to Enterprise Tuesday. This series of seminars runs, I think, to try and keep as many startups and businesses as possible. The startups and businesses that the Judge Business School feeds into the Cambridge Enterprise Maternity Unit out of the palliative care that could otherwise result. So tonight, more than any other on funding, we'll try and give some insight into how best to fund your business vision. to introduce the panel to my left, Goncalo de Vasconcelos is a long-standing figure at the Judge here, an MBA alumnus of the Judge, and now a lecturer here, and founded the innovative crowdfunding platform Syndicate, where they seek to merge the benefits of an angel funder, of a really well-informed funder, with the power of the crowd. And since stepped back from that, remains a non-exec director, stepped back from that to found the insurtech startup Renewal, and will tell us a bit more about that, I'm sure, in a moment. So Goncalo, welcome. Dr. Dobrée is the head of the Cambridge University Enterprise Seed Funds, and has helped to launch, do you know how many startups out of Cambridge? Quite a big figure, I would have thought. And remains involved with a great number of those. Now, Anne's background originally was in biotechnology at Edinburgh, and then immunology, PhD in Cambridge. And then, since then, really probably one of the most experienced technology transfer investors. Would you call yourself an investor? Yeah. Certainly in the country, if not further afield. So, Anne, it's a great pleasure to have you here this evening. And Anya Roy. Anya, again, an alumnus of Cambridge, from Christ, I believe.
Yeah.
Moved from there into the financial industry in London, tall towers of the city with Barclays and Goldman's. And I've done my time there myself. It can be quite hard work. So you moved quickly off into the venture capital world at IP Group. And since IP Group has become an investor and a founder of businesses yourself, recently founding Syrona Women, which is a health tech startup aimed at the ladies among us, I think. So my short introduction. I'd like to ask the panel quickly to confirm, say a couple of words themselves, perhaps to introduce their own businesses, their own take on this evening and what we're here to achieve. And then we'll move on to questions. So, Goncalo, would you like to lead off?
Hello, good evening, everyone. Is this working? Yeah, seems to be. Great. Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Goncalo. I was, as George said, an MBA here back in 2010, 2011 in a full-time program, which I obviously loved so much that I stuck around and I'm still here somehow. Since then, I started a company called Syndicate, just down the road from here, actually, which is, as George has very eloquently put it, it's effectively allowing people like you and I to invest alongside business angels and VCs and other professional investors into exciting startups. Back in the summer, I stepped down as the CEO of Syndicate and decided to do something else, which I wasn't entirely sure what it was. So I started by traveling with a family. And in the meantime, as it happens, on a Tuesday, I had the idea for Renewal, which is my new startup now in InsurTech. And what Renewal does is very simply, for those of you that have insurances here in the UK, every year you'll get an auto renewal letter where it will tell you, if you have your car insurance or your house insurance, and it will tell you, hey, great, thank you very much. You don't need to worry about anything. By the way, your price is going to be this much. And if you organize, you'll remember the price from last year, and you'll remember that it's somehow magically a lot more expensive. So you have two options. You either stick to the same insurance provider, which is expensive, or you have the hassle of on a Saturday morning have to go shop around, compare deals, and then cancel one, start the other one, etc. And what we do is we use artificial intelligence to do all of that for you. So you don't even have to fill any forms. All you do, you send us your current insurance documents to us, and basically we use that to take the data so we can run the quotes on your behalf. And then we present, hey, look, this year you can save £150 by moving from insurance A to insurance B. Would you like to save £150? You say yes, and we do everything for you. So you have to do two things. You just send the documents, and then you accept, and that's it, done. So you don't have to worry about your insurances ever again.
Excellent. Cool. Hi, I'm Anne. As George said, I'm head of seed funds at Cambridge Enterprise. We use the university's early stage seed fund to help start new companies out of university. I've been commercializing technology in the university for 20 years or so, and been head of seed funds for about 10. So yes, we've started a few companies. We have about 100 in the portfolio at the moment, and each year we typically do kind of 15 pre-seed investments, 10 seed, and 10-ish follow-on, something like that, through our team. And we invest in anything that's, well, Our remit is anything University of Cambridge related, but of course we have areas that we prefer to invest in and areas we don't like B2C. But we're always happy to have a talk with anyone about your company, and if we're not suitable investors for you, we might know someone who is.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Hi, I'm Anya, and as George mentioned, I am a proud alumnus of Cambridge. I studied at the Department of Biotechnology and Chemical Engineering, and I also sadly studied in Oxford as well. So yeah, so I have this awkward question, which is about, you know, which one's better, and I just say no comment every single time. In terms of, you know, my professional background, I started off in banking, learned a lot around managing different companies, work ethics, understanding like the financials and what they really meant, and then moved into life science venture capital at IP Group, investing in the best of spin-outs from research coming out of UK universities, and that was quite exciting because, you know, I got to meet people like yourselves, of course, and then soon I decided to put my money where my mouth is and set up my own company, Syrona Women. So we were tackling some very difficult topics around women's health. A way to describe it is an on-demand virtual women's health clinic, but we were tackling topics such as endometriosis and some of the gynecological cancers, and this was done in partnerships with researchers from various universities in the UK and the US. So I'm happy to answer some of the questions you have around setting up your own business, commercializing research, and also fundraising, especially for female founders.
Thank you very much. I think as a first question, we start right back at that very, very early stage, the sort of first gestation of a business idea. And Anne, if I come to you, how many of the 15 businesses that CE supports pre-seed really know what they're going to be doing? And does that affect their ability to raise funding with you?
Probably about half, but even then it will change. So our deal flow is probably half people who have decided they want to set up a business around their research and know basically what they want to do. They have their plan. It may not be a good plan, but they have a plan at that stage, and enthusiasm. And that's great. And those people we give, they typically know what they want to do to get started, and we have little pots of money that we can give them to help them along the path. And their plan will evolve as they build their team out and as they get more experience, but they kind of know where they're headed. The other half of our deal flow is basically technology that's coming out of, say, you know, Professor Tim Cox's lab, where we think it'll make a difference to society, and the university wants to see it get out there through a new company. So that starts off with no one having, you know, it is just a technology, there's nothing else around it. And then we use the little bits of money to build a team and bring it into a plan and a company. And so that definitely starts from know nothing, but hopefully gets to something that's investable by the end.
Mm-hmm. Understood. And Goncalo, when you first started building, well, first came up with the idea for Syndicate Room, what were the first steps you took into approaching the challenge? And that first sort of steps into securing finance for it as well.
Yeah, so when I had the idea for Syndicate Room towards the end of my MBA, so I used some of the projects like marketing and so on to try to put something together. And if you, in case you're wondering, actually the name behind, the reason for the name of Syndicate Room is because the idea, I had the idea when I was in a room here, for those of you that studied here, in a room that is called the Syndicate Room, which is where students can sort of brainstorm and so on, and that's where I had the idea.
And was it a Tuesday?
Was it? Now you're testing my memory. Yeah, it might have probably. I would imagine so, because definitely 79% chance that it was.
Yeah, that's true.
Then the challenges. I mean, everything is a challenge. So the problem, particularly being sort of first-time entrepreneur on building a more sort of a scale-up company. It was my second company, but it was the first one that could actually have that sort of potential for real growth. It's just I didn't know how to do anything, to be honest. So everything was a challenge, you know, from do I set up as a limited company or as a LLP? And if you know what you're talking about, it's actually really easy. But when you don't, you just spend days just researching it and fun. So yeah, I just read a lot online about what I had to do next.
Mm-hmm. Understood. And Anya, with Syrona, which side of Anne's funding division did you fall? Was the business idea there, or was the technology there? Was the skill set there?
I think a bit of both, really, because the technology was coming in from some of the principal investigators from the different universities that we'd spoken to. From the business side, having been an investor myself, I had a slightly softer landing. And I say slightly because it wasn't soft. So it's a combination of both. So I had a bit of both, but not necessarily the full concept. And things changed so much in the years that followed. It was incredible looking back at the actual business plan versus, what the company was to be. So yeah, you can say you have a plan, but you've got to be able to pivot and change and take feedback and improve all the time.
And to what extent is that sort of change driven by the investor themselves rather than the market or the business?
I think it's very core to keep the customer and the problem that you're solving very much the core of the business, because without it, there's no need for your technology, there's no need for your business to be set up. And it gets proven maybe, once you set it up and you don't get the traction you require. So, eventually sometimes there are companies that have the technology and are trying to find a problem to solve. I like viewing it the other way around, is that you find a big problem, you really understand the problem, and then you find the exact technology to solve the problem.
Yeah, I think that's true. Particularly if you are a tech company, it can be far too easy to kind of polish your technology in a lab somewhere until it's perfect and not spend enough time talking to customers. I mean, especially, some businesses are set up and funded so that they're not dealing with customers for, 10 years or more potentially if you're a biotech therapeutic, but you still need to talk to them in that time period so you are going to the right place.
Yeah, understood. That's, particularly in therapeutics, without a doubt. And do you often come across businesses looking to spin out from the university where over-engineering is a problem?
Yeah, I think, it's one of the things that a lot of people in Cambridge talk about is, talking to your customers and trying to get out there. So I think we don't see it as a huge problem all the time, but there are definitely some companies that are better than others. And that's when, as Anya said, if you get that feedback that you can pivot a bit, that makes a far better road in the end.
Yeah, understood. And to what you talked about pots of money that can help somebody along the way when they're in that pre-seed stage. Do you mean grant funding and so on?
Yeah, there's pots of money all over the place in Cambridge. We have our own. In our funding structure, we can invest 20k on a very soft loan, or up to 75k on a loan, and we use both of those kind of bits of money to help get things started. But there are, particularly on the engineering side, a number of programs where there's follow-on funding for research grants, or Mercer awards for engineering, things like that, RAE fellowships that people use to pull money into their starting company. Yep. Or people just bootstrap it. The famous story is Jonathan Milner with his loan for a kitchen, which I'm sure he won't mind me repeating because I've heard him say it before. He got a bank loan for his kitchen and spent it on Alcam. So, that's one way of doing it.
Do you know who provided that loan?
I think it was probably Barclays, I'm afraid.
Northern Rock.
Was it? All right.
If we found out.
Depends how successful the
Depends
company
how
is.
long. Yeah, exactly. Waited a few years,
you
would have been
wouldn't
absolutely
mind.
fine. Yeah. But Goncalo, that early stage, what sources of funding were you looking at for Syndicate within that first 6 months? And then how did that change with renewal?
To be honest, when you start, you just need any cash because you don't have any. And it's a struggle because no one really believes you. Even your idea, they go, okay, look, I like you, but I think your idea is rubbish. Or I like your idea, but I'm not investing, and they find some sort of excuse, and you just need the cash. And everyone keeps on kicking the can further down the road, saying, I'll come back when you have numbers. Like, yeah, when I have numbers, I don't actually need your cash. Thank you very much. So it's like it's a really tricky catch-22 for entrepreneurs. And unfortunately, there's no easy solution, because before you have the numbers, you have to understand it from the investor's perspective, is that before you have the traction, it's incredibly risky for the investor, particularly if they've never met you before and there's no sort of existing relationship and trust in place. And but but by the time you have the numbers, then of course it makes it a lot easier to raise finance, because then you have investors knocking at your door and going, oh, great, well then, can we invest now?
Because that's why it's easy for the university to take risk in backing startups, because we're not actually doing it for a financial return at our stage. If you think about the university's balance sheet, our fund is, change under the sofa. But what we are doing is creating that societal impact from companies, so we can take that risk that a financial investor or pure financial investor wouldn't.
Yeah,
and it's much harder if you're just talking pure finance.
Yeah, exactly. It is, because there's nothing proven, right? That's the tricky part. And you also need to understand from the investor's perspective is that it's just a complete shot in the dark, especially if it's first-time entrepreneur. There's a technology that is not proven or a business model that is not proven. And usually, most cases, they probably tick all the 3 boxes. And it's very hard to raise money at that stage. And it was so for Syndicate Room, it took me 18 months to raise the first decent round.
And you mentioned societal impact, but that must, as a business is going to raise a seed round, that must bring you into conflict, perhaps, with other seed investors, co-investors to that round? As Cambridge Enterprise, is that?
No, because we don't prioritize. So I guess we're not a social impact investor in that we do some social impact investing, but we're not saying the company has to be purely about social impact. The impact is actually the university demonstrating that its research goes on to other things outside the university and not just research results, which of course are valuable in their own right, but this other impact is nice to have too.
Yeah, understood. But Anya, I guess that's a different challenge in the sort of health tech that you're looking to deploy.
Yeah, healthcare is highly regulated, quite complex, and it's not something where you get it right through trial and error, like, a lot of tech, you don't do error. So I think that aspect is, of course, very challenging, and you rely on grant funding to a certain extent to de-risk your project. So the Innovate UK grants are great, if you can leverage that to fundraise for healthcare or other regulated kind of businesses. The other route, I think, which is quite interesting, is through accelerator programs. So finding an accelerator that fits your business, and not all accelerators are made the same, and this is really important to know. So the value they provide and the equity they take should match up. And finding a good accelerator is something worth putting some time into, especially in the very, very early stages of the business, because what they can do is help you sort of leverage their network and find that springboard to get you connected to your seed investors, Series A investors, etc.
I think it's one of the things about Cambridge that it's not easy to raise money, but it's maybe easier than anywhere else, because at least there is this network, and you can the stories of Mike Lynch raising money in the pub for autonomy. Although maybe that didn't work out so well in the end. But anyway, yes, we'll move on. But there are people in Cambridge who will invest in businesses, so you just need to use your network. But if you're new to Cambridge, then finding your way into the network can be quite hard, and that's where accelerators, I think, are really valuable, because we find a way into networks.
I slightly disagree that it's that hard, because I was new to Cambridge, right? When I moved here in 2010, I knew absolutely nobody in Cambridge. And because it's a small network, what you need is the first step, and don't waste that first step, don't waste that first coffee, because if you go in and you meet one of the investors here around Cambridge, and you go and you meet that person, you ask for money straight away, chances are A, they're not going to invest, B, they're not going to introduce you to anyone else. But if you're going to ask for feedback and genuinely feedback is not feedback, you ignore all the and then you just ask for money at the end. You really get the feedback on board. And then you ask, look, would you mind telling me 2 or 3 people that you think could be helpful? And that's the amazing thing in Cambridge, that people do say, oh yeah, I know this person, and this person in your space. And then you follow up with an email and say, look, you mentioned these 3 people. Would you mind just making a quick introduction? And then suddenly from 1 you go to 3, from 3 you go to 9. And then before you know it, you have pretty much the whole sort of network covered. What you need to be careful with is because it's a small network, it's great if you are good and you're not wasting their time and you expand very quickly. But if you're not, you're just wasting their time. Very quickly, you just get kicked out of it, and people talk about it, and then that's it. It's a much tougher job to raise money after that.
I have to agree with you completely. I mean, Cambridge feels to me like a small enough city that you can know lots of people, and really work with the same people more than once, more than twice, more than 3 times. But actually, it's a big enough place that there's this groundswell of economy and enterprise in the city, which is fantastic, and great fun to be a part of as well. And Anya, you've done a lot of work over the years in London. Do you find that that's different in London, and how so?
Yeah, I mean, definitely London has more investors. I'd say there are more well-established VCs, accelerator programs, even sort of angel groups. So I think there are more of them. But being in touch with all of them is very challenging. And one of the upsides and downsides is they all know each other. So, one of the problems is, if one doesn't like you, sadly a lot will not like you. And the upside is that if one really, is sponsoring you, really vouches for your startup, you will automatically find the other investors for that particular round to syndicate. So there are some vices and privileges of being in London. I think Cambridge has a great sort of ecosystem, though, both tech, life sciences, in whatever you end up setting up your business in, and it's a good way of getting feedback before you jump into the London network and tap into that. And a lot of the Cambridge VCs and investors alike are quite, well connected with the London network and ecosystem too. So they'll help you no matter what. So yes, it's different, it's nuanced, but every place is. So yeah.
Understood. So if an accelerator, for example, can give your business and yourself as an entrepreneur that badge of credibility when you've been through the right accelerator, you think co-investors as well and the investors in your own business can do the same to the company?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think having smart capital is incredible. Having access to that. So when I say smart capital, it's beyond just any check, but as as we've already established, any cash is good when you're just starting out, and cash is king. So, spend wisely, of course, but at a point, smart capital becomes really important. The people you put on your cap table will dictate how much pain you're going to go through in life in general. So, when people say fundraising and finding your investors, sort of like finding your life partner, it's like a marriage, they're actually not kidding. So it's genuinely who are the people who are going to be the ones who are going to pick you up when things don't go well? Who are the ones who are going to be an incredible pain or challenge, for the next 4 or 5 years of your startup? So I think it's really important to get the investor mix right.
I think, and even more than that, if you get the right investor, they will have years of their own experience in your market and sector, and they will be bringing additional knowledge to your business that will help you.
And when you're looking at those businesses at that very early stage, do you have in your mind roughly who the right co-investors for Cambridge Enterprise are going to be, depending on the sector and so on?
I mean, yes, there's always a danger of trying to create, the perfect syndicate, and I've seen companies try and do that, and it doesn't normally go well. But obviously, we know people in different sectors, so if it's a therapeutic, we'll be talking to people like Syncona or Medici or Abingworth, or, usual life science investors, whereas if it's maybe some more hard tech or smaller funding need to start with, we might talk to Cambridge Angels first of all, or Cambridge Capital Group. And we work quite hard on kind of knowing who's investing where and who's active. But I think that's, even if you don't come with any pre-existing knowledge to that, that's something you need to spend a lot of time on, is doing your homework. There's a great blog actually called Both Sides of the Table, where an existing VC, whose name I've forgotten, has about 10 blogs on how to raise funding, and I would recommend you go and read all of them. But one of the whole blogs is about doing the homework. Who's investing in your sector, who's investing in your stage, have they invested in something competitive to you, have they got cash at the moment, all of that stuff. And you need to spend a lot of time doing that hard work to start with.
Understood. And Goncalo, you were able to, I think if I remember rightly, take investment from a bioscience investor quite early on in Syndicate.
I did, yes.
Life cycle. How did that come about?
Pure luck, I think. So after spending over 18 months, I think it was about 20 months or so, trying to raise money for Syndicate and really getting nowhere, I got it was actually the long story short is that I got investment from a syndicate of investors which were not smart money, but they were cash. And so we put all of that together around August, right? And if you consider this was about 20 months or so after I started trying to raise money for Syndicate Room. And then the very last minute, of course, because of the due diligence, they had our documents and the accounts and so on. And I was all excited. I've just hired the first hire. The money was ready in escrow and account and so on. And very last minute, they pulled out. And because they pulled out, so that was half of the syndicate was from Cambridge Angels. The other half was from another group of investors. The other group of investors pulled out. And they basically didn't pull out. They changed the terms at the very end and said, look, we want the vast majority of the company. They wanted 75% of the company. So I told them to go to a certain place, in certain words. But basically, I was missing half of the round, and on that day I had to fire my co-founder because we had no money to pay and we were running out of cash. And if you're a director of a company that is owing money, you get into trouble. And then I called this individual from life science background, who is Jonathan Milner, who was the founder of Appcam. And this was August, and he's on holiday in Greece. He was, and I couldn't get through very well. And I said, look, I have this problem. I had chatted with him a couple of times, so we didn't really know each other very well. And he sends me a text saying, oh, please call this number. And it's like a number this long. And here I am with no money whatsoever as a person, no money whatsoever as a business, having to call an international number. Like, this better work out, because otherwise I won't have any money to pay this phone bill at the end of the month. So I'm there for half an hour explaining him the situation, and he was brilliant. He was, look, Goncalo, I'm on holiday. I can't do any due diligence. So I know your side of the story, but there's always two sides. But make me a deal, and you'll have the cash by the end of the day. So I hung up. I thought about it, and I told him the deal and the valuation and so on. And I said I'd needed £80,000. And his response, he said straight away he would not negotiate. And his response was, yes, but 100K to be worth my while. So I'll take 100K, thank you very much. And so that's how I got him. But he was not from a sort of B2C or fintech background. And then in the process, we became very good friends, and he got involved, and then eventually sat at the board of Syndicate Room. And the importance of having that really smart money and a really good investor that really understands the highs and lows of being an entrepreneur is invaluable. It's just absolutely worth it.
And you make a perfect point there, which is that actually a smart money doesn't have to be from the same sector or from somebody with exactly the same academic background, etc. It can just be somebody who can add huge value in your business.
Yeah, look, being an entrepreneur is always going to be hard, and you need someone that understands the low points and understands actually the last thing you need is a stick on your head. You just need help, and okay, let's find a solution. And that's what good investors are very good at, is supporting you rather than beating you down. And sometimes you need a beat down if you're not performing as well. But
well, hopefully
fine.
not
That's
too
fair,
often.
Right? If it's a fair beating, it's okay.
Yeah.
I can take it.
Your investors will have heard that and bear that in mind with renewal.
Damn it.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard quite a bit from the panel. I hope that set the scene for the evening and for the seminar. I think we should open questions out to you. Now, there are microphones floating around. Can we hold them up? So we'll try and get a microphone to you as quickly as possible, but we'll take questions from the audience. And the first hand I've seen from Tan here. Now, if you'd like to fire your question, I'll repeat it back to the audience.
One of the things I'm just looking at Anne's profile. She started in 1999, so you must have been a teenager when you started.
I'm old.
This commercialization from the university. I'm trying to reduce my points to one or two questions. One is that I've heard that Cambridge is a great place to start up a business, especially the tech.
I think you might need a microphone, otherwise I can't hear it.
Life sciences sector. Then I've heard opinions that a lot of the investors tend to invest in companies that have come out from students or research done at Cambridge or one of the local institutions. And the second one was that I slightly disagree with the panel when you say money is money. And I think dumb money can harm your company more than smart money. If you agree to sell somebody what they call fools who buy your first round and they set a price for you and the price is too high, it will affect raising money from professional investors.
Yep.
So please don't take dumb money. If you're going to take money, give them a...
So what I meant is, dumb money will hurt your company more than smart money, no doubt about it. But dumb money will be better than no money.
But
trust me on that.
You have a very promising technology, and you've basically sold equity at a price which the professional investors don't value at. That will cause problems.
Yes, no, I understand, and that is a risk. I think people starting out it's very hard to come to your valuation, your first round valuation of your company when you've not done it before. So entrepreneurs starting out obviously are very excited about their idea and value it highly, might look to America for pre-money valuations and come to, we've had people come to us with looking for a 30 million pre-money valuation for, a seed round, which is just... That went well. We're nice folk, we will still talk to people. If an investor ever says to you that your pre-money valuation is a bit toppy, what they mean is it is completely bonkers and they're just being polite. So, but yes, the danger of that is if you raise money at too high a valuation in a round, the next round, your company will not be worth that value of your pre-money plus the money that's gone in, and then you'll have a down round or a flat round, and it just does not look good for your company, and it's very painful. So yes, that is...
I think to your point, though, in terms of smart capital, really important, as I stressed, but in terms of capital not necessarily being smart, it can still be good for your company if the terms are right, and you can always get advice. So one of the things that I advise all startups to do is get a third party to review your terms, give you some seasoned advice on whether the terms look like you can actually go out and raise your next round without the current term sheet being crippling. So smart capital is great and is the best kind of capital you can get, but access to smart capital is not necessarily that easy.
Well, and Goncalo, you're an expert in the crowdfunding space, really, and that clearly isn't particularly smart money because of the nature of it. So how does that compare with other forms of investment?
That's the whole point behind Syndicate Room, right, is that you have the smart money going in first as a business angel or VC, setting the investment terms, and then the crowd effectively goes in under the same valuation. And for that reason, precisely, and because if it's the entrepreneur setting the terms, they will always want to go as high as possible, which at that point in time sounds like a really clever idea, and then then further down the line, not so clever. Then it can really make it tricky to raise money again, at least without going through a bit of a period. But yes, so I mean it's valuation we could be talking about here the whole night, because valuation is not. And it's not a science by any means, right? And some people are very good at telling a story, and that alone might double the valuation of a company because they're very good at telling a story, and there's nothing there.
There is kind of a market level in Cambridge for a seed round, which is probably around, depending on progress, tech, all the rest of it, ballpark. So this will be far too high for probably half the companies in this room and too low for the other half. But if you think about $1 million pre-money for a seed round, that's probably roughly where you'll be sitting.
Okay.
There's always exceptions, of course.
Useful to know in the context of Cambridge, of
Yeah.
course. Let's not talk about Silicon Valley, where they seem to be
Yes,
on a
exactly. That would be
different
50.
planet, let alone a different scale. Ladies and gentlemen, a second question from the audience.
This one. Yeah, George.
Yeah.
Hello. My question is for Anya. So I just took the liberty of looking up your company a little bit to read a bit more, and I find it quite interesting the way that you've structured the company. So as I understand, you outsource research, like you said, from different PIs here, from the US as well, to create this home testing kit stuff. My impression of biotech startups, even just taking one technology and turning it into a startup is quite a risky venture, but you've gone and taken multiple and tried to make it into one. I wondered how that has been for you. Has it been particularly challenging procuring funds because you're, well, on face value seems quite risky? Yeah, how has it been?
So there's several ways of answering this question. The PIs that we have on board are, have an amazing track record, and that itself, de-risk the projects quite a bit. A lot of the fundraising that you get is tranched, so it's very common for a lot of investors to do tranched investments. So you hit milestones and you get a pot of funding. And that's how we've done collaborations with a lot of pharma companies as well. We've pitched pilot projects with them. We've got tranche funding. So a lot of it is actually based on results, and I think that's what's made it quite successful. We've also had a very different way of tackling the problem. So, in terms of biotech startups, a lot of them, in the diagnostics or therapeutic space, sort of just go underground for like 5 or 6 years or even 10 years, and then they just come out at the end of it. So we've kind of been different because we've taken an approach where we're aggregating something what we call digital biomarkers as well. And that's actively engaging with users over time. So we're collecting longitudinal data from patients across the world for a long period of time. So we're still engaged with the audience, and we're very much still a biotech, company, but we've just approached it differently, and our business model has been very different. So I think there are several ways you can still approach, going through different, like creating a platform company essentially, and that's by ensuring you've got funding mechanisms for each of them, and you've got milestones for each of them. Yeah. And
fundamentally, your business is a B2C business, whereas many other biotech or health tech companies
ours
would be
is
B2B.
B2C and B2B. So yeah, we've done both. Yeah, and it's challenging, because it's the narrative you have to sell to investors who are invested in the B2C part, and then the B2B part, which is us transacting with the big pharma companies such as Merck, Roche, Bayer. So it's very challenging. It's certainly not easy, but if you think you can take one pitch deck and get funding for all of it, I think you're lucky, and well done you. But essentially, like our pitch decks, that we've had over time, every investor has got a tailored pitch deck. And that's difficult, and that takes time. And that means you have to do a lot of research on their interests, their ticket sizes, the kind of companies that they have, your anti-portfolio, what they're going to ask, everything. So that takes time. And a lot of people, it's easier to, send your deck to 100 investors with one deck, because you don't really have to change it, do you? But if you have to go out there and put in the effort to tailor it to all of them, that takes time, which means your investors will also appreciate it and get back to you.
Well, at the very least, you've got to change the date on the pitch deck and the investor's logo as well.
In fact, I'll just follow up on one thing. I would say I would never send your deck to 100 investors. Never send a deck to anyone unless you should always have an introduction to them, because they only invest in 1 out of 100 things through the door, and the 99, that they're not investing in, the majority of those will be the things that have come through the door cold. You have to find an introduction to get your deck in front of someone.
Another question from the audience. Where am I looking? Second row here, Eugene.
I was curious about a slightly different case, which is a hypothetical large company that might be interested in a spin-out venture. Obviously, large businesses have lots of finance and, in theory, could fund that entirely themselves. But do you think getting co-investors, whether it be angels or others, is actually sort of quite a good way of getting the founders to really test the business model and deliberately go through the kind of hard process to understand whether that is viable or not? Asking for a friend.
Well, I can tell you my experience now with Renewal as I was raising money, and because it's such a relationship thing, right? If you definitely go for an introduction when you can, and these days LinkedIn makes it actually quite easy to try to get an introduction if you're well connected. But then it's not just that, because you get the introduction, then you sit down with for a coffee, and you need to build that sort of relationship and that trust. Now, the second time around that I was raising money for Renewal was, compared to the 20 months that it took me to raise money for Syndicate Room, it's going to sound really unfair to entrepreneurs that are trying to raise money now, but bear in mind my experience with Syndicate Room was pretty bad, right? So 20 months for Syndicate Room. Now, just because nothing has really particularly changed, just other than people know me and they trust that I'm not going to run away with the money and so on. I had the idea on the Tuesday, and I had it funded by Friday. And I didn't even have a pitch deck or an Excel spreadsheet, right? And so that relationship is really, really important. But one of the amazing parts in that process was just actually, so I just made one call on Friday, and that was it. But then after that, I went to meet quite a few business angels. And just the questions that they were asking, and just by listening to the questions they were asking, and their ideas and their experience and so on, which is so valuable, so valuable. And then there were another group that was very valuable, was the top tier VCs, where I went for a chat just so that they would be aware of that we're building something for the next round, right? You're just playing the cards for the next round, not for now. But then I took it one step too far, which was talking to tier 2 VCs that said, oh, I heard that you're building something, come and have a chat. And I went, and it was just a complete waste of time. Because they just basically after information, and they had no valuable feedback. So yeah, talking to business angels, I would definitely recommend, because you can, even when they don't invest, actually the majority of them won't invest, but they'll still give you really, really valuable feedback.
I think one of the upsides to the case that you're presenting is that you're not necessarily, focused on fundraising. It actually opens up your business to be something that can be focused on just building the foundation of the business really well if you're looking at it from a big firm trying to spin out a company. So you're not obsessed with fundraising like, a lot of other startups. So you actually have time to speak to your customers, to build out your technology, and you focus on that. And I think that is a huge unfair advantage for companies in that situation.
Yeah, I think I would second what Maeve said. Split the two out. Take the money the easiest way you can, but then spend the time talking to people and getting the feedback anyway. And then you'll have better conversations as well, because VCs actually, and even if you're going to be actually raising money, it's always worth talking to VCs or investors before you look for money, because when you know you're being asked for money, it's always an awkward conversation where you're trying to work out, how do I say no without offending the person? If you talk to people before you're looking for money, then there's no pressure. The VC doesn't feel like, oh God, I've got to say yes or no. They can just have a conversation about the business, who they know, who they can connect you with. And that's a much nicer conversation to have.
Even after I raised the money, I carried on talking to business angels, because I just had loads to learn. And it always comes handy for the next round. There's always a next round, right? There's always a next round.
And there's, of course, good form within the ecosystem in Cambridge for businesses being spun out of existing technology companies and so on. You have Gearset coming out of Regulate Software, or Trustonic coming out of ARM, and now an ARM Gemalto JV. And there are a number of other examples, some more recent. So plenty going on in that space. And another question from the audience. I had a flash of a hand here just before yours went up, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting conversation. I think what makes it interesting is that everybody's coming from a different perspective to it. So I was wondering, the question that keeps coming up in my mind is, what is kind of the biggest mistake, the one thing you should really not do because you were talking about it being a very closed network and very often things being connected to each other. So is there advice about one, I know it's not one, but like a big mistake you shouldn't do, and maybe on the other side, something that really gives investors a good impression?
So is that a mistake that you shouldn't do when meeting investors?
Yes, when you're introducing yourself for the first time, so not when you're still developing that relationship.
In my opinion, it's very easy not doing your homework. If you go and talk to an investor and you have no idea what they invest in, what their background is, etc., suddenly, straight away, they're just going to write you off because you're just wasting their time. So make sure and it's so easy these days. There's no excuse for it. You go on LinkedIn, you go on anything you can find online. You see that they founded company XYZ. You go see what the company XYZ does, and so on and so on. In my opinion, that's the greatest mistake.
I think this is, again, a Cambridge advantage, is that we're more of a relationship ecosystem than we are a transactional ecosystem. And one of my big preferences about Cambridge over London is that London is a far more transactional environment. But you never go for a coffee with somebody and start with what you're asking for.
I think one of the biggest mistakes entrepreneurs can make is not wanting to give up their company, not wanting to be diluted, not wanting to lose control. That is a surefire way to failure. And most people are actually investing in teams as much of a technology, or even more so than the technology, because the technology will pivot or change or be defunct or whatever, but the people will still be there. So the opposite of that mistake is to be completely open and ready and willing to expand your team, to hire people better than you, and to give up control, and that will make a far better company.
Personally, for me, like one of the things that people can't explain a lot of the times is actually who are their customers, who are they going to be selling to. They have no idea who's going to be buying, and not knowing your customer is a real issue. And if you can't articulate that, you definitely shouldn't take that investor meeting until you've thought about it.
Now, Cornelius, one sec. We've just got to take a question at the back from the gentleman. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we have George here. I'd like to ask him about the role of traditional banks in this. I mean, the traditional advice is, don't even bother to knock on the door of the bank. But the question is it time for that to change? I mean, the bank is not going to be an investor in the business, but they may lend you money. So pre-revenue, early stage, you may get money for asset financing from the bank.
Not if they've done their homework, but
this might
once fall to me to answer.
Maybe for the kitchen. They'll do it for the kitchen.
They'll do it for the kitchen. Yeah.
I mean, once you reach revenue, then there are other possibilities to borrow money from the bank.
The challenge is the difference in risk profiles at the end of the day. An equity investor is taking a risk profile that could see a return of 20, 30, 40% on their money if they've done well, 100 times if they've done fantastically. I spoke to an angel investor whose most successful investment was 276 times. Now you're comparing that with a bank where they're taking a return of 5% of their money, so they're never going to take nearly as much risk. So they're not going to be involved pre-revenue, etc., unless there are some very specific factors at play. Maybe they've asked for funding for their kitchen, and so you can support them. And talking seriously, many early stage businesses are funded on the back of credit cards and that sort of thing, because that's what bootstrapping is all about. There is the startup loans company, of course, but they'll take a personal guarantee as well, so it's really a personal lend. But banks can be much more useful in where they're human, where they have people in the ecosystem with their connections. The plumbing's just bank accounts and stuff that they can crack on. It's more about who they can introduce you to if they're at that sort of stage in the ecosystem.
At that stage, a bank loan is just a wrong instrument, right? If it's that early in that risk, it's just a wrong instrument where to get the money, because, as George was saying, you can't get the upside on the ones that work out to make up for the ones that don't.
Isn't there a government loan guarantee scheme for promising companies?
Yes, the startup loans company is for the very, very early stage. That's up to a maximum of 30,000, and that's basically a personal loan, but it is to a business, for a business. And then there are also other guarantee schemes, both within the Innovate UK architecture and within the government business loans architecture that you can access depending on what you're doing. So there are more debt options out there than I think people give credit for, but not at a traditional bank necessarily.
Potentially they're funding more traditional projects as well, compared to, if you're taking a risky life science business, it's unlikely for the bank to actually fund that.
I would recommend trying to get either grants. Grants are very good source of capital. It's just a pain to go through the whole process and application and the uncertainty and so on. Or I would really strongly advise to try to avoid personal loans to fund your business, because then, unless you're well off already before the business, and then you probably don't even need a personal loan. But otherwise, you run the risk of getting into really strong sort of financial pressure at home and in a business if the whole thing starts not working out. Because suddenly you're owing quite a bit of money to the bank or to whatever personal guarantee there is, and the business is not working out. And if you can avoid that, in my opinion, it puts an unneeded pressure, financial pressure on the entrepreneur. That the last thing you need as an entrepreneur is to have financial worries at home. You just need to not have to think about money at home. It doesn't mean that you go with a millionaire salary and not by any chance, because otherwise, what's the drive? But if you can pay the mortgage or the rent and the kids and all the stuff and the holiday in a comfortable way.
You've got holidays. You work for
entrepreneurs with holidays, yeah.
And of course, if you try and fund the business yourself beyond your limits to do so, you're not receiving the surety that an investor brings. An investor brings that third-party view that your business will be successful.
It's a good question, right? Then you have to start wondering, well, why isn't anyone giving you money? Why isn't anyone investing in you, in your business?
Yeah, no, good point. Questions? I've got Cornelius here and a second after that.
Thank you. We were talking about valuations and amounts of money, but what terms and conditions are actually really important besides that much for that much?
Preference shares. Do not take participating preference shares if you can avoid it. Preference shares basically means that the investor gets to double dip on taking their money out when there's an exit. So they get the money that they've invested first, or if it's a 1 times preference, it can be 5 times preference, and then they share whatever's left. And it always seems like a good idea when you think that your company's worth 100 million. What's it going to matter if the investor takes 2 million off the top first? Because we're going to be worth 100 million. Great if you're in that situation at the end, but the likelihood is that you're selling it for 2.5 million and they're taking 2 million out before it's shared between everyone else. So avoid preference shares.
But a lot of VCs insist on preference shares.
Yes, and then you have a problem. But you may have to take them depending on the sector. A lot of angels will invest using what's called a non-participating preference, which means they only take their money back if the company is failing, which is kind of fair enough. If your business idea turns out to be a complete donkey, then why should you walk off with the investor's money? They should get it back to invest in someone else. VCs typically, particularly biotech, will only invest with a preference stack. Then you have no choice.
Other things, there's a whole raft of things to be aware, to be honest, because then you can start getting into really tricky details. So, for example, if they have veto on your next funding round, because then suddenly they might put you against the wall, where they go for a really low valuation or they don't sign it off. And then if you can't raise money, you're going to run out of cash. And unfortunately, there are VCs that will do that quite happily. There's so many details. That's when it gets to that complexity, it's really worth getting lawyers involved. It's really worth it.
And it's also about options as well. Just seeing some of them have these sneaky terms where they have the option to buy at a later stage, and they have a stipulated time, and you can do some funny things with that. The even giving up a board seat. It's an interesting one. It's not right for every company, and you just have to be aware at what point giving that board seat along with that veto right is applicable. So there are a list of things, but you should always get third-party advice. Always get get legal advice on something like that.
There are things that can sound really bad, but actually, so for example, the board seat is a perfect example that can go horrendously wrong or can go incredibly right if you get the right person, right? The participation rights, if it's non-participating, sorry, the preference rights, it's non-participating, fair enough. You know, if they invest £1 million and then you can't do anything with the company other than to sell it for £1 million, it's fair that they take the money out, all of their money out, rather than them just taking 20% of the £1 million and losing quite a lot of money when you didn't succeed as an entrepreneur. So, you know, you need to understand where they invest. Yeah, they are. It's really worth getting good lawyers involved, and particularly if it's an experienced, friendly entrepreneur or investor.
Yes.
Got two at the back here, one forward.
This is kind of a bit of a related question in a way, which comes back to not just the share cap, which you talked about. I'd be interested to hear what you think about debt capital as in convertibles as opposed to preference shares. So that's one aspect. But the other is, how do you then think about structuring the shareholder votes versus the board seats versus who the directors of the company are, and what challenges have you faced with that? Because it's not just about share cap.
Convertible.
Two questions. Do you want me to tell you the questions again or not?
One was about the convertible notes.
One was about the convertibles.
Yep.
Second's about composition of board shareholder votes versus the
I can
share
take
cap.
the second one.
Okay,
I'll
so
take
Not to
Yeah. The convertible note, if that's an option with, you know, the right cap and the discount, take it. Convertibles are great for startups who are just starting out with their business because you don't have to set a valuation, right? You don't, so it's converts at a cap, yeah.
Yeah, but 20% is market discount. If it's a 20% discount, that's what's market.
And then there's an interest rate attached to it as well. That's pretty standard. So convertible safe notes are, you know, the best mechanism for equity and for very early stage startup. And they tend to be the most favorable way of doing it because it doesn't push you into the corner of actually being able to value your business at that point in time.
And the paperwork's normally lighter, so it's quicker and cheaper and all the rest of it.
So I have more experience of this somewhere else than here.
Just
not a very friendly environment regarding convertibles here, not found it to be.
I think it depends on the stage. Pre-seed, I think we do convertibles before in pre-seed funding. But maybe not so much later on. And it also maybe depend if you're getting money from angels. Angels aren't always allowed. If they're doing an EIS scheme investment, then it has to be basically an advanced subscription. They can't actually get it back. So then there's little benefit to them, apart from avoiding the valuation question, which is always good.
But the other thing was about the votes. So shareholder votes versus directors versus board composition versus you as a
So there's usually a huge confusion between, and I know I had this for years and years and years, between shareholder votes and actually board of director votes, right? So if you have whatever number of shareholders, doesn't matter, but 100% of the votes there, they vote on certain matters that are usually quite high level on the company. So for example, if you raise the money to run a tech company and then you're pivoting to become a restaurant, you might want, you might need shareholders' votes to approve that. Or if you want a new funding round, or if you want to, certain actions are typically corporate actions, and you need, depends on your documents, but 60% or 75% is usual. Try to avoid when you have in those documents that you need 90% or more, because one investor is on holiday and that's it, you can't do anything. You're blocked, right? But then what directors of the board vote on are actually very different matters. They're much more sort of operational day-to-day, right? You have this mandate to build a company doing whatever tech, clever stuff. The board is there to make sure that the strategy is executed, is the right strategy, there's the right sort of, in my case, for example, both with Syndicate and renewal, the right compliance in place and so on. And the votes from the directors are on much more sort of day-to-day operational elements. Actually, the shareholders have nothing to do with it. And a great example that I found was, I had a shareholder, so we closed an office in Portugal for Syndicate Room, right? And it was all very operational. It was for financial reasons and staff reasons and so on. And we had that question by a shareholder that we didn't go on for shareholders to vote. Actually, that's one thing that shareholders are not voting on. The board is the one making that decision. Yet, operationally, that makes sense. That's what we're doing. So that's the sort of level of difference that between the two parts.
And it's fairly standard what investors will ask for. I mean, it's pretty much the same from every investor. And that there'll be investor consents at the business level, so you can't change the business you've invested in, or the auditors, or the board, or things like that. And then the day-to-day operational stuff will come down to investor director consents. And most investment documents will have this kind of double layer of consent rights that the investors want. And you know, this comes back to this point about control, and you have to give up control in your company, because it's perfectly reasonable for people who are giving you, you know, between, say, £1 and £30 million to help you grow your company, but they should have some say in how you're spending that money.
Sorry, I was just going to say, everything what you say will be determined by the shareholder purchase agreement or the shareholder agreements and the Articles of Association, which sometimes are reinstated to reflect. I mean, somebody who invests 10%, owns 10% of your company, may have veto rights, which actually give them a lot of influence.
Yeah.
And if it's a strategic...
If it's in the shareholders' agreement, yeah.
You know, they have all sorts of rights, drag-along, tag-along rights, anti-dilution rights, down-round protection rights.
Well, yeah, exactly. You need a better VC if you have all those rights. So you're absolutely right. So shareholders' agreement. So for those of you, I don't know how much you know from a legal background, but Articles of Association is a document that is usually it's registered with Companies House, and it just sort of says in very high-level principle on how you run the business. Shareholders' agreement is, as the name says, is an agreement between the shareholders, and it doesn't even have to be with all of the shareholders, right? And the shareholders' agreement may have things like how much do you want percentage or investor consents for your salary, for example, as a director. So you can't certainly go for to a £500,000 salary. And it has certain veto things on, for example, if you have not disapplying preemption rights. I mean, that gets very, very technical. But yes, you basically have sort of three levels. You have one that is all the shareholders that vote, for example, 75%, so that you can issue new shares on a new funding round. Mm-hmm. You have the shareholders' agreement, which says certain things that certain investors will have to vote on, and you need their consent. And then you have the board of directors doing the operational side. Sorry, that didn't help at all, did it?
So, Tal, I need you to use a microphone when you ask a question. Because we're streaming. So,
I've done 3 companies now.
But hang on, can I stop you until we get your microphone? Do you have a question, Tal?
No, I was just making a comment about
Can we get you a microphone before you say? Because otherwise the people on the stream can't hear.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I've done 3 startups. I'm now working on my 3rd startup. And the first startup was I was naive, and
welcome to the club.
I sold a lot of shares to people who said we love the company. What happened was the Daily Mail and the Sunday Times basically did a piece on a company, and that attracted a lot of investors. And because we had certain unique ideas on how we wanted to run the company, which was basically we employed a lot of women around the world, a lot of people who are disabled, so a lot of the NGOs and the impact investors picked up, and the BBC ended up making a documentary. So as a 30-year-old who didn't know anything about shareholder agreements and even board resolutions, having experts around who helped, and even they can screw up as well, because if they're not au fait with certain new changes, we had investors that were from Sweden, we had investors that were from California, from Dubai, from Hong Kong and China.
Get lawyers. There are plenty of good lawyers around in Cambridge.
Yeah, and they'll all give you an hour for free to do a beauty parade.
Having a very good lawyer, and as you said, having a very good non-executive chairman or someone who has an experience of running companies, helping you, guiding that through is very important. And
they're worth a lot of money if you have a good sort of non-exec chairman or someone to help you with those things. Yeah.
And that can guide you, because I had to learn the hard way. I some of the things that we did, and I look back and say how stupid I was. I can't believe I agreed to those terms. But now, things like drag-along, tag-along rights, I can give any lawyer, the run for their money and actually sit in front of a lawyer and do an agreement.
Is there going to be a question?
To an agreement.
I think there should be a lot of work for the lawyers in the room on the back of this. But Tan, can we take a question from the audience? Yeah, that's right. Thank you for contributing.
Question at the back.
Question straight up at the back. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yes, please wait for a mic. Yeah.
There's a mic up
There's a one there
there's
just there.
a question waiting here.
Oh, and a question here.
Yeah.
What would you? Sorry.
Hi. Since only about 3% of females get VC funding, I'm wondering, especially as a female founding team, I'm wondering what you could do as a female to be in that 3%.
Oh, that's a very good question.
Gosh, yeah.
I was expecting how to increase the 3%, but how to be part of that 3%.
Well, Anya, you mentioned this in your introduction, so perhaps.
Yeah.
you
What
can
do you
help.
think? You know.
Yeah, I think network with other female founders and female investors. Find out who is investing in female founders and find them. Because obviously that is their sweet spot that they're choosing to invest in. They see the value of female founders and they're much more likely to invest in you.
Does that fit with your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging, and I really do acknowledge it. And you know, sometimes you do have to go out and find those female investors and find a sponsor for your business, someone who's vocal about what you're trying to sell or build, etc. And that's quite important itself. But to be honest, in terms of, you know, being that 3% of women who get funded, a lot of it actually comes from backing yourself. And I find that, you know, and I suffer from it myself, and I'll be very honest about it, imposter syndrome, right? So a lot of us tend to think that we're not fully there yet. And one of the biggest things is, you know, if you don't back yourself, no one else will. And that really comes through every time you pitch, you put forward your story about how passionate you are. And of course, there are systemic issues with this, the investor landscape not being as diverse as the founders are, etc. So that there's a lot of things happening. So, for example, you know, the WhatsApp groups which have like just for female-founded businesses go on. There are lots of groups that are very active for female-founded businesses as well. So you'll look at the Albright Collective, for instance, in London. They're just a meeting place just for female founders. You'll find someone called Jane VC. You know, they only fund female-founded businesses. So there's a lot of activity in the space, and that is not to say just because you're a female founder, don't go just trying to find that female investor or, you know, VC that only invests in female founders. Go out and back yourself and pitch your company and your story to everyone as you do. And, you know, people like you are going to change the system, which is clearly not designed in the right way. So they're very small changes, but they're happening, and you need to. So one of the things that I find is a lot of investors will come in and say no, and I've said this myself many times as an investor too. What you need to hear is not no for now, maybe later. And you know, you need to come back and improve, and so a no is never fully a no, so keep going.
So a constructive no rather than a flat no.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and your question feeds well into Gina's introduction about
Enterprise
women earlier on today at the Judge Business School program.
Can I add a little point, tiny point? On Anya's point, spot on. Not to take things personally, not to take no personally. Take it as a challenge to better the business plan or the deck and come again later and try again.
Thank you. And we had a question at the back in the middle.
Thanks. So I was wondering, what would you say is a healthy amount of time for a founder to be spending on raising money for their business?
Tough question.
10%. I know, it's just out of the blue, but just enough to get that feedback that I was talking about earlier. But the sad reality is that we all tend to spend way, way, way more than we should to raise finance. And that means that then we don't have enough time to focus on what really matters, which is the value proposition, right? What is the product? Who are your customers? What do they really want? How much are they willing to pay? And so on. But yeah, the sad reality is that far, far, far too much time is spent trying to raise money and knocking it on closed doors.
An easy variable is that in capital markets, it would typically be between 5 to 10 days a quarter for the senior team to be working on the listing. So it can be quite serious. Is that a proxy for the venture funded world?
It's
perhaps,
certainly worth
perhaps
spending
not,
some
but
time to get that feedback, especially if you're not raising money. Right?
I would say
It's
way
really
more than 10%.
Yeah.
For the CEO, yeah.
It depends what stage the company is at. I mean, once you've got a team and a CEO with a tech or customer or sales or marketing team or whatever, some CEOs will spend probably practically 100% of their time fundraising whilst they're raising a fund, and then they might get a month off before they raise the next funding round. But of course, there are other things that need doing, like the strategy and running the actual business. So I don't know, how much time do you split?
I think it's really important to figure out what your roles and responsibilities are in the business, because there are some people who will be dedicated to fundraising and developing that fundraising strategy, and then for the CEO to then go forward and implement the fundraising strategy as well. So I think it's really important to figure out your role and how much time you're going to delegate to that. And, depending on the stages and how experienced the CEO is, those timelines will vary. There are CEOs who are very well seasoned, have done it many times, and they close within, like a week, and it's easy. Some CEOs who are doing it for the first time will take much longer. So I think it really depends. I don't think there's...
The only guarantee is that it will take twice as long as you think it's going to.
Yes.
Another question from the audience. Front left, back right. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. We talked about building a network, a relationship with investors, but how do you think that a newly graduated or anyway a young person with a small capital can do that? Or what do you think are the important, like the experience or the background that a person should have in order to be trusted by an investor?
I think one of the simplest ways is actually to find portfolio companies and reach out to their founders, because they very much want to help you, and that's some of the help that I've received from other companies who are on the portfolio and other entrepreneurs has been incredible. So I think it's one of the segments that's often overlooked, because you think, hey, they're fundraising themselves, but the amount of insight that they have on investors and the people that you need to speak to is incredible. So use it, leverage it.
I think the other thing is just remember that it's a sales process. So start before you need the money. Spend time talking to investors and getting their experience. Investors love giving their experience, and they're always looking for deal flow and want to know what's on. So you're not wasting their time, as long as you've got something decent to say, as Goncalo said earlier. If you're talking to investors, that is their job. So you talk to investors about what your idea is, you tell them what you're planning to do, you've started that relationship. You can then revisit it 3 months later and say, look, I've achieved what I've said I would do. Can I have your advice again? And you're building up that relationship, and you're building up the trustworthiness by saying, you set your own goals and you have achieved them and you're delivering. And then by the time you actually are asking them for money, they've already got a relationship with you, and they've already seen that you are delivering what you've said you will deliver.
So when I got investment from that life science investor that I was talking about earlier, Jonathan, I'd met him I think 3 or 4 times, and they're all at sort of random networking events in Cambridge, right? And then of course the first time I spoke to him, I have no idea who he was. The second time I was really nervous because I knew who he was. And then the third time I recognized him. I said, you know what, this is someone I want to be in touch with. So I just went and say hello and all that. And then the fourth time, same thing. And then when the funding round collapsed and I called him, it's talked about to each other about 4 times, maybe 5 to 10 minutes each time, right? And it's quite daunting because you're talking to these really well-known people that everyone is talking about, and you get there, you're a bit nervous. But the reality is that if you're going to build a business, you need to be out and about at events like these and others, and networking, working from co-working spaces. Really, really good. For me, it was a life changer when I went from starting a company in my living room to actually working in an idea space, just
upstairs,
or above or upstairs from you, right? Yeah. And because then suddenly you're talking to people and you get to know who's who in the ecosystem and who's doing what, and then you go, oh yeah, I need to do this, or you should talk to that person, and they're quite happy to make an introduction, and then I don't know, it takes time. But if you're out and about talking and networking and so on, you absolutely get there.
And if you're ever, worried about approaching someone at a networking event to, like Jonathan say, to talk to, you've got to remember, people are at these events because they are interested in finding new companies and speaking to new founders about what they're doing. They are interested in what you have to say. Hopefully, anyway.
And if they're arrogant, you just make a mental note, say thank you very much, carry on chatting, thank you very much, and then you leave, and you know that next time that's someone not really to talk to you. But most of these people actually, exactly as Anne said, they're really approachable. I remember getting very nervous about it just because, oh my God, I'm going to talk to, Hermanhauser.
But even the ones that say no, you can actually get something out of it, because the follow-up question for me always was, you said no, can you connect me to 3 to 4 people that you think would be relevant for us? So the no can still be beneficial.
Questions at the back?
Could you explain more about the ordinary follow-up procedures or hallmarks after funding? For example, as far as I understand, the investors might require KPIs after investment. So what kind of follow-up procedures that both sides need to understand and expect after funding or investment?
Well, it depends whether they're on your board or not. I mean, if they're on your board, then they're closely involved with how the business is going, and we'll be getting those KPIs live, and we'll be helping you run the business. The harder group to keep in touch with are the shareholders who aren't on the board, and I'm just as guilty as anyone of being involved in businesses, but it's only when you're coming to a funding round that you remember your other shareholders and think, oh God, we haven't written to them for a year, let's send them an update. And then the week after that, it's like, now you've had your update, can we have more money? So I think regular updates, you can decide, or you could ask your shareholders what they want to know, but regular updates and news flow of, what are you going to do for the next quarter, and then the quarter later, have you done it, what are you doing for the next quarter?
Yeah, I personally, I find it actually very useful to do roughly a monthly, very informal update, which is as simple as a MailChimp. Oh yeah, this month we did this X, Y, Z. And then a formal quarterly or half-yearly report, depending on what stage you are in the company. But the important part is, whenever you disseminate that information, make sure it's all the same to all the shareholders, because otherwise you could get very disgruntled shareholders, and potentially legally, you might be in a tricky position. So if you disclose something going, a big contract coming in, and then you raise money, and some people don't follow their money, some others follow because they know about the contract, and then you are sued by the people that didn't follow their money because they went, hang on, you didn't tell me about that contract. So make sure that everyone has this. It's just a matter of fairness as well, it's a matter of information.
Sage warning from Goncalo. I had a question at the front here.
Cheers, thanks. I'm curious about how most of what we talked about today, or you talked about today, I guess, about raising funding from angels, VCs, etc. How that translates to less revolutionary, or the buzzword's disruptive, startups, where if you were going into a more established space or targeting to be, it's far less glamorous, but an SME or something of a reasonable size, instead of trying to explode in a much higher risk environment. How much of this applies, what changes? I know it's very broad, but just the, I guess, overarching differences.
You're completely right. We've been focused on funding for IP-rich businesses within our topic. We've neglected actually the best sources of funding for a business out there, which are the customer base and the supply chain. fundamentally, if a business can generate revenue, there is the cheapest form of funding available. So you make a very, very good point. But I don't know if the panel would like to
So you're
approach
asking
that in
about
context.
raising equity capital for companies that they're not necessarily going to be 100 times bigger in 3 years' time.
Not necessarily equity.
Other
could
sources
be debt or revenue. Or I know equity is very expensive from a business's point of view. So it was more. I mean, obviously, I'm quite ignorant of all of these things. So it's what makes the most sense in those scenarios instead of I'm going to cure cancer or something.
Yeah.
Can you do it from revenue? That's the best way.
Okay, so revenue always.
Well, revenue is the best way because you're not giving anything away. And then once you got revenue and assets and so on, you can get debt into the company further down the line. That will, in the long run, be much cheaper than equity finance.
Yes.
Thanks.
There's also grant funding.
Grant is great.
You know,
R&D,
you're not
R&D tax
diluted at
credits.
the end
Have
of
you
the
ever
day.
heard about R&D tax credits?
No.
It's worth doing the research. So if you're doing any sort of research, it's a scheme that it works in Britain really well, which is you can submit it and then you can get a certain percentage. It has certain rules, you need to read about it. But you can actually get quite a bit of, I know companies getting hundreds of thousands of pounds a year out of R&D tax credits.
And quite often they can be a lifesaver in between funding rounds. If your new funding round is taking a little longer to arrange, R&D tax credits can be, because you can get them back in 6 weeks sometimes, can be what keeps your company alive. But if you've got maybe a more consultancy type of business, rather than, you're right, VCs will only invest in scalable companies that are going to give 10 times return minimum on their money. Angels, likewise, although angels will look at things that are maybe more like 3 times rather than 5 times. They will look at smaller scaling businesses, but if you've got a consultancy type business, then it's not going to be right for that sort of investor because they're looking for a bigger return. And then you are looking at, how can I get contracts in that are going to pay me above, a decent enough margin to fund the core of the business and grow organically.
I think to answer your question, though, some of the moonshot investments, some investors will take the view that they're going to invest in the business just to learn about the sector as well. So there are some outliers who will do it purely as a moonshot investment to learn about the sector and get a better view or understanding of it. And they're harder to find, of course, but yeah, I mean, as he said, if you can generate revenues, then that is the best way.
Yeah.
Don't take anyone's money.
And that doesn't necessarily, of course, have to be consumer customers. I mean, that could be a collaboration with a pharma business that's bringing you in a pilot project or some kind of consultancy type rate. It doesn't have to be actually selling a product to the man on the street.
Yeah,
Depends,
that's what we
of course, on the
did.
business.
We didn't actually sell it to direct to customers. We were selling it to. We did a pilot project, a collaboration with big pharmaceutical companies, and they paid us based on some of the milestones that we achieved. So, yeah, I think that was a good way forward for our business anyway.
Fundamentally, equity is the most expensive form of funding the business can raise. If you can seek debt, it's marginally very cheap. If you can, best of all, seek revenue or supply chain finance, some sort of working capital solution. That's the traditional way of doing it, and it's worked for a lot longer than the venture capital industry has been around. But, ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching our time. We've got time for one more question. Got a hand in the middle. Yeah.
Thank you, George. In terms of getting your first funding and securing good valuation, if you're a lucky guy, how do you value the relative importance of good IP or filed IP, I want to say, having that actually in the system, or demonstrators or prototypes, something tangible that the investor can play with and understand, or traction with customers, perhaps, letter of support from a big multinational or something. Like, in terms of these 3 things we should focus on, what would you put at the front? What do you value them relatively? Of course, all are great.
I think what you're talking about is credibility, and we were talking earlier on about credibility here. But is there a way to rank those? Do you think they have?
Customers.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, they can all run in parallel. Right?
Yeah.
And they should run all in parallel. But out of the 3, customers just show that you have someone that is willing to pay the price for product or service you're providing. And that is like a goldmine to investors.
Yes. But
I
actual
think it's-
customers.
Yeah, but it's also dependent on the type of business that
Yeah.
you're running at the end of the day. So if you can have all three, then yeah, ideally.
The only flag I would raise of customers, when you mentioned multinational, you know, a letter of kind of interest from a multinational doesn't count because it will take them 2 years to get from that interest into actually being a customer. So you need actual customers, not just.
It's certainly worth looking in the vertical that you're exploring at when other businesses bringing new technology to market have raised funding and what traction they've had in the market when they've gone to do that. You know, when do they have their reference customers? When do they have their testimonials?
And not just the customers who don't pay. You know, there are lots
Yes,
of
yes.
you
Users.
get lots of
Yeah, yeah.
users. So someone who would be willing to pay for your product.
The IP, for example, is really is not something you think about.
Yeah,
the
no.
IP alone is not really a.
Yeah, no, it is. It's just you asked us out of the free.
Yeah.
For us, you know, when I mentioned kind of the £1 million valuation, that will go down if there's no IP. It'll go up if there's customers.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are hitting time, so I'm going to have to bring the questions to the close. We've heard from the panel this evening on a wide range of answers based on their personal experience of fundraising. We neglected terribly traditional revenue as the best form of finance for a business, and that's a very Cambridge symptom, I think. But yeah, let's look there first instead of trying to give away half the company. You'll have a chance to ask more questions of the panel after the event. We're going outside for drinks and networking and so on. But for now, it just falls me to say thank you very much to Goncalo, Anne, and Anya, and to ask you to say thank you as well in the normal way.